South East Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
South East Radio.
Welcome back to South East Radio's Business Matters with me, Karl Fitzpatrick. Well, my final guest this morning is one of the most powerful women in Europe. Emily O'Reilly has had an illustrious career, starting out as a journalist and broadcaster. She then became Ireland's first female ombudsman before being appointed European Ombudsman by the European Parliament in 2013. Emily, thank you very much for joining us on this morning's show. In your opinion, how do public servants view the office of the Ombudsman?
You're more than welcome, Karl. Good morning. Well, I think in general we had, when I was Ombudsman, and I think that's continued under Peter Tyndall, a generally very good and a very positive relationship with the administration. Of course, sometimes they didn't particularly like being complained about. I mean, that's normal. I wouldn't like it. You wouldn't like it either. But I think there was a very strong sense within the Irish public administration that the role of the Ombudsman in holding the institutions to account, really, on behalf of the people was a very important part of the infrastructure, if you like, of the architecture of the administration. And even though perhaps they had to grit their teeth sometimes, I think in general they felt that the Ombudsman's recommendations should be followed unless they were completely crazy, and which they, I think and hope, never were.
And of course, you were appointed European Ombudsman by the European Parliament back in 2013. What was your goal when you assumed the role of European Ombudsman?
Well, I actually had to I had a very simple goal, and simply to make the office more visible and more effective. I've been quite familiar with the Office of the European Ombudsman because the European Ombudsman shares a network of member state ombudsmen. So I'd been Ombudsman in Ireland for about 10 years. So I knew the office quite well. I knew some of the people working there. I knew my predecessor, Nicky Forciamondouros. He had been formerly the Greek Ombudsman. So I was kind of familiar with what was good about it, and I was also familiar with the gaps. And so I knew I had a very clear strategy mapped out that I just wanted to make people more aware of the office, and that the cases that we did would have more impactful and more effective outcomes.
And what does the role of the European Ombudsman entail?
Well, an ombudsman for the EU does pretty much the same work as an ombudsman in any of the member states. So, but not in the EU, the administration is the EU administration. So it's all of the institutions, for example, the Commission, the Council, which is the member state governments, the Parliament, but the administration of the Parliament, not the political decision making it does. And then agencies like the European Medicines Agencies, which regulates the medicines we take, like the European Central Bank, which we're all pretty familiar with in this country, all of the regulatory agencies, and also Frontex, which is the border agencies which protects the external borders of the EU. So if you have a complaint, if you're making a complaint to the European Ombudsman, it can't be against the member state administration. It has to be against an institution, an EU institution. So let's say, for example, you're a small civil society, you're an NGO in Ireland, and you've got a grant for a certain project in a community, okay? You get the money and you start rolling out the project, and the Commission might think that you're not doing it properly, they want some money back, they have problems with the way you're doing it. You think that isn't fair, you make a complaint to the Commission, if they don't satisfy you, then you come to me. And what I do is exactly what I did in Ireland. I go and I ask the institution, well, what's your story? Go back to the complainant, go back and forth, and then eventually make an analysis and see whether the Commission has done something wrong or that it has acted perfectly appropriately, and then I make a recommendation, if necessary, as to redress.
And are your recommendations binding?
No, they're not. I'm not a court, but the vast majority of recommendations that I make are accepted. I mean, it's a much freer way of working in a way. You don't have the formality of the courts. It's also free to access. And so you can have a lot of back and forth with the institutions, which you wouldn't normally have in a courtroom and with a judge making binding decisions. Some people ask me if I would like greater powers, but I think, the whole idea of the Ombudsman is that it's informal, and very often it's dealing with cases that you couldn't bring to court anyway. For example, if you write a letter to the Commission and they don't answer you, I mean, you're not going to go to court, but you can come to me and I can pick up the phone and say to the Commission, you haven't rung this gentleman, or you haven't been in contact with this gentleman, please do so. So a lot of cases that are not capable of really wouldn't be a good idea to take them to court because they're so relatively small and minor. But at the same time, you can get redress if you come to the Office of the European Ombudsman.
And if somebody is unhappy, let's say, with a decision of the Ombudsman here in Ireland, have they an opportunity to appeal that decision to the European Ombudsman?
No, in a way that the title is a little bit misleading, European Ombudsman, because some people think that you can be the appeals body from the member state ombudsman, but you're not. You're the ombudsman for the European institutions. That doesn't mean that sometimes we have had cases, that might have been with the national ombudsman before, but in those cases there would be an EU law element to them, and that's why they come to us. So when I was Irish Ombudsman, sometimes I get complaints and I'd send them to the European Ombudsman. Equally, the European Ombudsman might get complaints which actually had to do with the Irish National Administration, and he would send them to me to be resolved.
And in your opinion, have Boris and the Brexiteers done much damage to the EU's reputation?
Well, I suppose it's a mixed bag. I don't think they've done much damage to the EU's reputation. I think they did damage to the EU's reputation in a way that painted a caricature of the EU over many decades. So the reputation of the EU, as seen by many people who eventually voted for Brexit, was not a fair one. It was a caricature. It was the sort of the straight bananas and the crazy things that the EU is supposed to do, which is not at all representative of the actual work that the EU does. But unfortunately, by the time the Brexit referendum came about, that image of the EU had kind of penetrated the mindset of many people in the UK, and it was too late to turn that around in the few weeks of a campaign. I think what the Brexit referendum result, of course, has done, I think it's probably solidified to some degree the unity between the other member states, and that's a good thing. And I think as well, when people saw what happened in Brexit, a lot of people regained those feelings of EU solidarity, and particularly young people. I mean, in the months and a couple of years even after the Brexit referendum, a lot of new groupings, organisations were formed to promote and support the values of the European Union, and particularly by young people.
Now, many will say that the European Union is struggling to prove its relevance to the citizenry across the European states. In that respect, what do you think should the EU do to repair or enhance its reputation?
Well, that's a big and broad question. I mean, I think, look, most people don't wake up in the morning worried about the EU at all. They get up and they're worried about, their families' lives, and working life, schools, their health, all of those daily issues. They don't think too much about the EU. And when they do think about the EU, I suppose what they want to trust that being inside the European Union enhances their lives in their member state. But I think the problem sometimes with the EU is that it actually doesn't communicate well enough with individuals and with member states, people in the member states. I mean, I think that became very clear, again, going back to the Brexit referendum, when I remember reading in the weeks and months after the referendum, people in the UK finding out to their surprise that the local community hall was actually funded through the EU, or the Erasmus year that their child is going on was also courtesy of the EU, or the fact that their local beaches had been cleaned up was also thanks to the EU. An awful lot was going on within the UK that had come about through EU laws and EU money that people simply weren't aware of. Now that's not confined to the UK, but you can see if people aren't made fully aware of what the EU does, and also how member state governments and ministers involve themselves in the making of EU laws when they go to Brussels. Then you're in danger of having that sort of negative caricature of the EU develop in other states.
And in your opinion, Emily, is the perception of elitism a problem where the EU is concerned?
Well, sometimes it's other elites who are describing the EU as elite. You're always going to get elites in any big institution, organisation, whatever you want to call the EU and its institutions. Yes, but I think that really goes back to my answer to the question you just asked prior to that one, which is about communicating what the EU actually does. I mean, one of the things I decided to do after Brexit was to start an award scheme for the EU administration to sort of, share best practice, but also to showcase some of the work that the various EU institutions and agencies do right across Europe. And I mean, even officials who are working in the EU were themselves surprised to find out what their colleagues were doing in other agencies, bodies and institutions. And there's some wonderful work being done. I remember we gave the overall prize one year for work that was being done through rare diseases, whereby the EU Commission basically, instead of leaving member states, and particularly small member states, on their own to deal with perhaps just a handful of people dealing with a particular rare disease in the country, managed to get 19 of the member states to work together with their scientists, with their health personnel, so on, so that collectively and collaboratively they could put their heads together and come up with, if not cures, but certainly ways to make the progression of the disease less severe in the individuals. And I remember at the time reading an article about a family and 3 young boys who had been struck down by a particular rare disease, and then looking at the work that was being done, led by Europe in relation to dealing with these things. So that was just one instance of work that has been doing at EU level that probably very few people are actually aware of.
And in terms of transparency, how does the EU perform?
Well, again, a very broad question. I think in many ways much better than some of the member states. I think the institutions are generally quite transparent. Where it tends to break down, though, is at council level. When I say council level, I mean the ministers from the member states who go over to Brussels a few times a year to debate legislation in relation to various sectors, from the financial services to agriculture and so on. And there it can be very difficult to see what's going on and essentially to find out what position your own member state is taking. That is very difficult. And that's important, especially now, because at the moment the EU budget for the next 7 years has been debated and drawn up and argued over. But over the next few weeks we're going to see the proposals for this big climate action plan that the Commission is going to roll out over the next few years. And of course people will want to see, how is this going to affect this country? Are we getting money for this? Are we losing money for that? So those decisions are all going to be made by the member states, probably at council level when the ministers go over. So if people want to have their say, have their voice, or try and influence this, they need to know what's going on at council level. So in general, transparency quite high at institutional level, but at the council, that's where it starts to break down a little bit.
And in terms of transparency, what practices should state agencies here in Ireland put in place to ensure that they are transparent?
I think what was good about the Freedom of Information Act was that it did expand the number of bodies that came under it. It included the Gardaí, for example, for the first time, which was quite important. I think sometimes people talk transparency sort of as an abstract term, but actually what it is, it's about making institutions accountable to the public who pay for them generally, but also giving legitimacy to them. And above all, people need to trust. You could say that in the UK, because for the reasons that I've given you, and for other reasons, people had started to not to trust the EU because they found the narrative given by the pro-Brexit people a lot more compelling. So people, trust is the glue that holds the union together. So really the EU and the member states themselves, within their own countries, through their parliaments and so on, they need to be constantly making the case to the EU, because the EU isn't in Brussels, the EU is in Dublin, it's in Bratislava, it's in Rome, Madrid, everywhere. That's where the EU is. People should stop trying to think of it just as concentrated in Brussels and really take responsibility for how the EU operates in the member states themselves.
And of course, International Women's Day is coming up just around the corner on March 8. And you recently spoke at a Women in Leadership in a New Decade seminar. What was your core message at this, Emily?
I suppose in a way I'm surprised that female leadership is still a discussion point, that it hasn't yet been taken for granted and just discussed generally under leadership. When I left school in the 70s and started working in the 80s, there were a lot of structural problems which, sort of went against the possibility of women not just working outside the home, but combining those. There have been huge changes since then. Of course, we see women in top posts right across many sectors of Irish public and private life. But as I mix with the younger women and hear them and watch them and so on, I do find that there is still this cultural piece within a lot of young women which is making them less confident than their male counterparts, even though on many occasions they beat them academically, outstrip them academically and so on. And I find that even when I've done interviews over the years and a young woman comes in to be interviewed and she can be very apologetic and defensive about what she's done and isn't willing to be as confident about her achievements as men have. And I think until this particular culture of diffidence and modesty is sort of got out of the female system, then I think we're still going to have a bit of a gap between women in leadership roles and men in leadership roles.
And on that basis, what advice do you then have for aspiring female leaders?
I think find techniques to develop your confidence, believe in yourself. If you do go for a particular job, make sure it's a job that actually suits your own interests, suits your own talents insofar as you can. Because if you do that, then you're going to be good at it, and if you're good at it, then you're going to be propelled, hopefully, along the ladder of success. But also, I know this sounds a little bit airy-fairy, but I do mean find your authentic self. Don't try and read a book on leadership and think I have to be X, Y, and Z. Find what is in you that makes you good, that makes you perform, that makes you happy, and then find your way to success through that. I think women tend to have to do a lot of work on themselves to make themselves more confident and whatever, because I think, I often see if you put two people in a room and one is a man, he might be very tall and wearing a suit and whatever, and then you put a woman in the same room. I think there's an unconscious bias towards the male because that is the way culturally we've been. A lot of people have been brought up. So women, even before people get to their leadership piece or their professional role piece, they have to get through subconsciously several barriers about how she looks and how she is and the fact that she's female anyway. So they're still within the culture a lot of barriers. Some of those barriers are in women's heads as well. I'm sure they were in mine quite a few times throughout my career, and I know I've had to work to get rid of those too. So I do mentor a lot of young women because I have 4 daughters myself in their 20s, and I see how they are in the workplace. I see the barriers that they come up against. So I'm very conscious of the battles that some women still have to have that leadership voice heard.
Of course, your position as European Ombudsman expires in 2024. Back on the 1st of June 2003, you received your warrant of appointment as the Irish Ombudsman from the then President of Ireland, Mary McAleese. So on that basis, have you any aspirations to become the President of Ireland in the future?
If I had €1 for every time I'd been asked that question, I'd be a rich woman. I mean, I just went through an election for the European Ombudsman, and one thing I vowed to do is never run for any election again, even for my local book club. So, I mean, that's your answer, Carl.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was the European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, and I'd like to thank Emily for providing us with a rare insight into this important role.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.